On behalf of the speakers program, UCLA, I'd like to welcome you all to our 46th program of the year and our last program, and the first program that is delayed on account of rain. It's our pleasure to have with us today the Mayor of San Francisco, Joseph Alioto, and it's my pleasure to introduce him now since we're running a little late.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do something very, very superfluous. I'm going to say in advance that I'll give a very short preliminary statement, and then we'll have a rough, tough, rugged question and answer period. And what's superfluous about what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you in advance to be just as personal, just as controversial, and just as obnoxious as you want to be. I'm going to invite you to do that in advance. And all I'm going to ask in return is that you let me be personal and controversial and obnoxious too, and maybe in that fashion we'll get right down to the heart of whatever issues any of you have any interest in. I find that students particularly are not interested in political monologues these days. I find that there's a good deal of cynicism among students, and justifiable cynicism. I've made the point before, wish to make it again, that as far as I'm concerned, if those in political life with the power of decision would just borrow a little bit of the impatience that students have with racism, or a little bit of their impatience with war, or a little bit of their impatience with poverty in this kind of a country, and would borrow some of that impatience, it would be a desirable, and it would be a good thing. I think you're aware of the kind of power that you folks are going to be wielding in this country more and more. I was back in Washington this last week, in New York and in Washington. Last night I attended the opening of that great cultural center in Washington, the John F. Kennedy Cultural Center, and the night before that I was at a birthday party for Mr. Hubert, Senator Hubert Humphrey, and then on Monday in New York with John Lindsay, on a conference in which we were trying to work out means of converting this great reservoir of talent that we have unemployed at the present time in the aerospace industry, converting that talent to the uses of the city so that they can work on the urban crisis and help us solve some of these things that appear insoluble. But before getting into that as rugged a question and answer period, and you can go range on any area at all, whether it relates to my personal life or my political life or any other part of it, you can range in any area at all. Let me just say a word about the status of dissent in this country today. I continue to find it very, very difficult to understand why it is that the public authorities particularly are so jumpy about handling the matters of dissent. We live in a constitutional democracy in which we have gone very, very far in saying that everything is protected by the First Amendment. The 14th Amendment as applies to the states. There's a freedom of speech amendment. We have protected everything except a small area of pornography and a very small and diminishing area of the law of libel, and a very, very small area of kind of speech that constitutes a clear and present danger, like the old saw by yelling fire in a crowded theater. You know, we don't let people exercise their free speech that way. Now, except for these very, very limited areas, we are dedicated to the notion that it's only by a rough and tumble debate that we're going to be able to hammer out those judgments which appear to be in the common good. Now, that being so, and we ought to recognize historically too, that dissent is the kind of raw material that progress is made of. And therefore, we ought not to think in terms of permitting, put the quotes on that, permitting dissent. We ought to think in terms of fostering dissent and encouraging dissent, and particularly with those who can look at things as though they're looking at them for the first time. It doesn't make any difference that the judgment may be, for that reason, a little bit deficient in the sense that it's being looked at for the first time. Because on the other side of it is that you can look at an issue without the kind of barnacles that may have attached to it in the eyes of those of us who are a little older, on the thing. And so a fresh look at issues, generation after generation, is a highly desirable thing. Now, that being so, you'd think we'd have fewer problems with matters of dissent. And I want to give an example. I mentioned a moment ago to some of the newspaper people. We had a great Vietnam Day demonstration in two cities in this country, one in San Francisco and the other in Washington, D.C. And we had 200,000 people who in San Francisco marched from the Ferry Building all the way out to Golden Gate Park and wound up in the polo field without a police incident. Without a police incident. Like there was one arrest for drunkenness or some minor thing, but without a police incident. In advance, the leaders of the demonstration met with the policemen. They worked out the route. They were permitted to select the route that would give them what they thought would be the best, the most convenience in terms of assembling the group and in terms of having a really representative group at the polo grounds at Golden Gate Park. Arrangements were made for microphones and for platforms and for the distribution of literature, and the police helped to shepherd the traffic, and at some point they actually helped to distribute the literature. But it was made very plain that while the governmental attitude was not just to fulfill the requirements of the 14th Amendment in this case, the freedom of speech, the right to petition government, and all of the others, not just to fulfill those requirements, but to go far beyond them, to be absolutely sure that dissent was unfettered, that anybody with an idea to express, whether it was popular or unpopular, hateful or cherished, would have the opportunity to express it. And because we're that, we can also go on the other side of it too. That anybody who thinks he wants to break a window, or thinks he has to break a window, or thinks he has to raid downtown Market Street, or bother the merchants, or bomb the Bank of America building, that we were prepared to use whatever police power, I don't care whatever it was, whatever professional police power, and local police power. No National Guards, no paramilitary groups, no, none of that type of business. Whatever local professional police power was necessary to stabilize the violence. It seems to me that under those twin concepts that there ought to be no problem about having demonstrations anywhere, and no reason to arrest huge groups of young people and release them the next day, or no reason to refer to them as stormtroopers, no reason to refer to them under any kind of a guise. As I say, the matter of dissent is something that ought to be encouraged in this country in the light of our constitutional tradition. Now, we have a pretty good constitutional tradition in this respect, and I think our rules for handling these matters ought to be related to the principles that we've developed out of that constitutional tradition. They've been pretty good. I don't think anybody has any basic argument about the manner in which the Supreme Court, up to this moment, and that last qualification is one that I think has some significance. How the Supreme Court up to this moment has interpreted the rights of dissent and generally the rights of personal freedom under our constitutional guarantees. And so this business, even in the second demonstration, not the Vietnam Day parade itself, but the second demonstration where there was an obvious attempt to tie up traffic or to block a city or to do these other things. Even there, the notion that you arrest 10,000 people and then you release 2,500 a week later and another 2,500 10 days later, as against the fact that in precisely the same circumstance, we arrested 59 persons who, after warning, persisted in engaging in violence and blocking streets and blocking buildings and refusing people access or an attempt to tie up traffic. This was a selective professional police matter that was handled in that fashion. It'll be tried in that fashion, but not this idea of mass arrests. And furthermore, this notion of infiltrating student groups on the theory that they constitute some kind of subversive and active danger to the republic obviously has the effect of inhibiting dissent. And to the extent that it inhibits dissent, it does a disservice, not only to the constitutional tradition, but it does a disservice to the matter of present policy making. It is a matter of considerable moment in the formation of any judgment that you have as many views from as many people, particularly those who are more vitally affected than others. Now, the issues of our day, or the primary issue of our day, particularly in connection with the idea of how long you stay in a foreign war. That's all it is. How long you stay in a foreign war. Those who are primarily affected may have an insight into it, but somebody somewhat removed, who might even be profiting from the fact of that war, would have a much better insight. And it's an insight that anybody making the legislative judgment or an executive judgment in connection with legislation ought to have. As I say, there ought to be no reason why there should be this great confrontation because of dissent. It implies almost when there is a certain insecurity about your own ideas. If you aren't afraid of your own ideas, you aren't afraid to submit them in a competitive marketplace of ideas. Their ability to survive in a competitive marketplace of ideas, that ability to survive, is a pretty good test of the validity of those ideas. And furthermore, our social facts are changing all the time, you know. Our views of the world are being informed all of the time. I like to hear the paleontologists hang around, you know, and tell us that man is kind of a Johnny-come-lately in the sphere of things. We just had Dr. Leakey of Africa up in San Francisco in a symposium that was sponsored by the city, incidentally, the city and the University of California Medical School. A symposium on the evolutionary theories of the French philosopher Teilhard de Chardin. And we're told, of course, you know, that man is a Johnny-come-lately, that Dr. Leakey's African man, I believe, is 2 million years old, and he believes that they can establish that as a matter of fact. He believes that he can make an inference that it's actually, that man was around for at least 20 million years, but that would be, in the span of 24 hours, maybe the last half hour, and that before that time there's a great deal that went before him. Now he's telling us, and this is correct, that we are doubling our knowledge in most areas of science every 10 years. What we took to learn up until approximately 1950, we have more than doubled to the present time, and we are now doubling it every 10 years. We have more geneticists, for example, living at the present time that have ever lived in the whole history of the world. Now, if all of these facts are coming to us, scientific facts and otherwise, they ought to inform judgments, which means that you don't get rooted in ideas, that you look at your ideas and you test them almost day after day, or at least generation after generation, in the light of the new facts that are coming to you. And this is the way you test ideas. And that applies to political ideas too. And any time you inhibit dissent, or chill dissent in the current phrase, and they borrowed this phrase from the antitrust law, used to talk about things, subtle things that inhibit or chill competition without necessarily eliminating it. So any time that you chill dissent by methods which the infiltration or claiming the right, for example, to tap telephones in what are called, quote, national security, end quote, national security cases. Anytime that you chill dissent by these means, or by compiling elaborate files on everybody, not only compiling them, but also leaking them after you've compiled them, these things have a tendency to chill dissent. And to the extent they chill dissent, they badly serve the constitutional system that those who sometimes do these things refer to as a reason for why they're doing it, to preserve that constitutional system. They preserve it by violating it sometimes. In any event, that's my general view on that subject matter, and I'll be pleased now to take questions from any of you on any subject matter at all. Under the philosophy that I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. Yes, sir.
Have you any political ambitions?
Have I any political ambitions? I'm the mayor of San Francisco, as you know, and there's an election coming up in San Francisco in November of this year, and I have decided what I'm going to do about running or not running at that election, but I think the astute political observers around here will probably tell you that I ought not to be making announcements in Los Angeles as to what I'm going to be doing in San Francisco. Yes, sir.
You paid your income tax.
I not only paid my income tax, but when I became mayor, I gave the local newspapers a complete statement of my financial affairs and told them that I don't think any other political figure's ever done this, and told them I didn't think it was any of their business, really, or anybody else's business. That I was giving them to the newspaper publishers as trustees for the public. And any time they thought, in their sole discretion, that any political action of mine might be influenced by any economic facts of mine, or that the public was entitled to know any of those economic facts, that they were free to publish them. That's what I did before I actually took office as mayor, when I was running in the campaign. And when this recent business came out about the governor's income tax, a number of us were asked about ours, and I reported that I didn't have as good an accountant as apparently as some other political figures, that I paid, and it's a matter of public knowledge now, and I told them they could have it privately but use it publicly if they wanted to or felt they had to. I paid $200,000 of tax in the last 4 years to the state of California alone, the state of California. Let me say about that subject matter, because it has some interest. I don't think, it really is, I really think that what the governor paid as taxes or didn't pay as taxes is his personal business, with one exception. I think we have a right to know whether or not the losses which offset his income, his known income, whether or not those losses were in relation to any element of the tax reform measures which have been before the legislature and before him since he's been governor. I think we're entitled to know that. We ought to have a flat, unequivocal statement. If, for example, they came from an oil depletion, let's just say that, to use that as an example. I don't know that they did, and I haven't any knowledge on it at all. If they did, that's a subject matter which has been before the legislature, before him as governor, on which he has made public pronouncements. And we would be entitled to know that if he had an interest or a bias or a prejudice based on the personal knowledge. Except for that, if he lost it in an ordinary transaction, I mean, if he went into a hamburger business and lost $100,000 in the hamburger business, that's nobody's business but his. And I would defend his right to keep that secret. The only exception being, did the loss which offset his income come from an element which has been before the legislature or before his office in connection with tax reform? It also emphasizes the importance of tax reform and the injustice which is being done in our day to property owners. These are the most unrepresented people in our society today. These folks that own a home, which is kind of a reservoir of capital, you know, after you've paid your taxes. In many cases, it's all a retired school teacher has or a retired worker has. And yet there is an unfair burden of taxes placed upon that area. We desperately need tax reform, both at the national level and the state level, particularly to eliminate these loopholes. Yes,
Do you favor building tall buildings along the waterfront in San Francisco?
Do I favor building tall buildings along the waterfront in San Francisco? I don't favor tall buildings, and I don't favor short buildings. I am for beautiful buildings. Not everything high is ugly. Not everything squat is pretty. I mean, they're just a question of artistic conception. For example, the Ducal Palace along the Grand Canal in Venice is not an ugly building. It's one of the great buildings of the world. Those of you familiar with Oslo, that magnificent, thin, high structure on the waterfront, happens to be a beautiful building. Now, we have made a determination in San Francisco that shoreline of ours, our view out to the bay and to the ocean, all the way from Ocean Beach around to Islas Creek, the southern part of San Francisco, is going to be guarded by a 40-foot height limitation, and nobody's ever going to build over 40 feet, except for that area which is the downtown portion of our waterfront. We're going to concentrate all of our high buildings in one place. Because high buildings, it is quite possible, young lady, to fulfill the claims of aesthetics and the claims of economic development. Now, you need economic development. If you will consult your history closely on the history of big cities, you will see that their great cultural periods, or those periods when they achieved the highest forms of art, were also periods where they had a kind of an economic thrust of prosperity going for them too. And cities can decay unless there is economic growth. The trick is to channel that economic growth so that it doesn't destroy the aesthetics, particularly of a city like San Francisco, which has so many natural points of beauty. So on our waterfront, we've had a recent debate up in San Francisco on the waterfront, as you know. And those who were against high buildings settled for using 10% of the space at 175 feet. Now, 175 feet is a 16-story building, or a 15-story building. And 10% of the space, in that particular space, was 5 acres. The idea that there is any beauty at all in 5 acres of 175 feet, as against, for example, a slender tower that only occupied less than an acre and that gave you great open space, or a plaza, or access to the waterfront. See, in the area of the ferry building in San Francisco, one of the very unfortunate things about it is that you can't get to the bay at that point. Even you're blocked visually by a 40-foot pier front, and you're blocked from the standpoint of getting there. No, there are no restaurants, there are no promenades, there are no public spaces. Now, a proposal that would give us a little higher building, doesn't have to be 500 feet, architecturally or otherwise, a design may be at 400 feet or 350 feet, or 200-foot towers. Provided you got that open space and a dedication to the public of a walk along the water itself, so that you don't have to be a boat owner or a fellow who belongs to the World Trades Club or one of these rich men's clubs in order to get a feel of the water at that point. So that question is always one of what is beautiful in the circumstance. The Chrysler Building in New York, the Seagram Building in New York, I think are lovely buildings, are beautiful buildings. That Pan American Building in New York, I think is horrible. And that they should do that is a bad thing. So there's no question of whether it's high or short. It's a question of whether it's beautiful and whether there's open space and access by the public. I think that's the real question. You wanted to add something to that?
Will the people be able to vote on whether they want those buildings there? Especially the ones that may be behind the buildings after they're built, because they're going to block their...
I don't see how you can have a vote on every building that comes up. San Francisco has some of the toughest ratio laws of any city. Is how much they'll let you build to ground space. We also have very tough requirements about getting by a planning commission and working out plans for a planning commission. Now let me tell you something about those buildings. One building, take the Bank of America building, and this, what's that old Latin saying, de gustibus non est disputandum, or something like that there's no disputing on tastes. Most people think that architecturally it has a very pleasing design. Some people don't like the dark color of it. They think that San Francisco is a white or a gray city, and that dark brownish color is not appropriate to it. But in any event, a building like that, has 7,500 jobs in it at every level. A janitor, a waitress, a file clerk, a secretary, a phone operator, an executive, and the president of the Bank of America, with a great deal of opportunity for upward mobility. And those of us who think that one of the toughest jobs we have in our cities today, and one of the great deficiencies of competitive capitalism, namely the question of jobs and employment, who think that that's very important to us in working out our ghetto programs, in assuaging the tensions, the racial tensions that exist in our cities, who think those jobs are important, can't overlook the fact that there are 7,500 jobs there with an opportunity for upward mobility. Now, you don't sacrifice the beauty of your town for jobs or cash or taxes. You don't do that. I just don't agree that you can't serve the claims of both art and economics. I think for the most part we've succeeded in doing that in San Francisco, except for two buildings. The terrible insurance building that they let them put at 35 stories right on the upward slope of California Street off Kearny, and the Fontana apartments on our waterfront that were there long before I was mayor. Both buildings were there long before I was mayor, matter of fact. On the other hand, the 50-story building built by Rockefeller in what's going to be Rockefeller Center West has a very lacy design. John Portman, the great architect, is a part of that venture. It's a great lacy design, and it's going to have a 5-block promenade where you don't have to cross at street level at all, just you're crossing on plazas. So beauty is the key, not height. Beauty is the real key, I think. Yes, sir.
I don't think it was really a question of beauty that a lot of those people were arguing. I think it was economics, and that those buildings provide mostly jobs for white-collar people and very few at lower income levels. And if they were building different types of buildings rather than like large office buildings, if they would build, let's say, low-cost housing, which is something that San Francisco really does need.
Well, let me argue with you about that for just a second. First of all, I want to argue with you facts. That the jobs are not jobs for minorities. Quite to the contrary.
No, I'm not arguing that. I'm saying, I didn't say minorities. I said, okay.
Well, they're white-collar jobs, you say.
Okay.
But we need white-collar jobs for our minorities. White-collar jobs are a way of upward mobility.
Okay.
So we need those white-collar jobs. Now on the construction, there are two kinds of jobs when you build something. One is the construction. The other are the jobs, the permanent jobs in the office building itself after you've built it, to take an example of an office building. Now on construction, we have by far the best apprentice for minorities, the best affirmative action program on apprentices of anything in the state. And the second city is a very, very poor second. 33% of our apprentices in the construction trades now, I'm not talking about the culinary trades or those, I'm about the construction trades. 33% of the apprentices are from minority groups. That's black, Chicano, or Asian. 33%. As a matter of fact, you remember when they had that little riot in Pittsburgh, that struggle between the hard hats, so-called, and the blacks? Same people who fomented that riot, or who organized it. Maybe foments has a bad connotation. Who organized it? Were on their way out to San Francisco because they heard there was a project out there called Rockefeller Center. See, this is a good name. And if you're going to have a propaganda deal, you got to pick on a good name. This happens to be a good name. And Jesse Jackson was on his way out in the bus with other people. They're going to do the same thing in San Francisco. So I assembled my black leaders in town, those elected as well as those appointed by me, and told them personally to select a committee and go down right now and count on the Rockefeller job how many minorities were employed. Right now, just sight unseen, just walk down and count them. They turned out to be something like 32%. I said, now fine, would you folks call the Reverend Jackson and tell him to go to some other town? He's wasting his time in San Francisco. And they did. They did. They diverted them. So this notion that the construction jobs, because of a fact that in many parts of the country, you're absolutely right about the fact that there have been lily white unions that haven't purged themselves of their past deficiencies in that respect, ought not to be applied generally, because I think in San Francisco we've done a pretty good job on that. We have. Do you want to take the question so nobody can accuse me of just selecting plants in the audience? You'll take them random.
Which one should I take? Yes.
You've been charged with bribing officials of the state, haven't you?
No, I've been charged with traveling for the purpose of committing a bribery which 3 state prosecutors in Washington couldn't find until John Mitchell found it. 3 state prosecutors had the same investigation and turned it down, you know. Turned it down. But what's the question? No,
I'm just asking you about the whole charge of bribery.
do you want the facts on the thing?
I'm asking you.
All right, the facts are relatively simple, and I said before that we're going to let the lawyers fight it out in court, but I would reply to any specific question on the matter. I represented the state of Washington in connection with a series of lawsuits against the electrical manufacturers charging a collusive price-fixing arrangement on a cartel arrangement. I represented 15 public utility districts and the state of Washington. The Attorney General of the state of Washington is not the Attorney General for the 15 public utility districts. He is not. He has no official relationship to them. He said in the beginning that he had to control and to work on the case. And I said that we'll do the same thing with you we've done with everybody else. And while not recognizing so-called referral fees, we would share the fee for any shared work. The extent you shared in the work, the responsibility, and the getting of the result, we would share the fee. I asked him whether or not he had the right of private practice. He said he had, and that's acknowledged by everybody, incidentally, that he had the right of private practice. It's also acknowledged that he is not the Attorney General for the public utility districts, any more than the Attorney General of California is the Attorney General for the Metropolitan Water District of Los Angeles, for example. The fees paid to him were paid by check, reported to the IRS in the years in which they were paid, reported to the IRS by me, the years in which they were paid, identifying him as the Attorney General of the state of Washington. Now, it's out of that share fee arrangement that the Attorney General has chosen to mount a bribery charge, which means, for example, that any legislator who's a lawyer, any legislator, care who he is, and most of them are lawyers, as you know, who shares a fee with another lawyer in connection with the case he's referred to him, can be charged in exactly the same way. Now, you recall that the late Senator Dirksen, just before his death, very frankly said that he received 1/3 of all fees from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, where they came to him and asked him to designate a lawyer for them. And he would designate a lawyer to handle the cases, and he would receive 1/3 of the fee, a referral fee, admittedly not for doing any work, the so-called referral fee. And this he admitted. And you recall we had a vice president who borrowed $250,000 from Howard Hughes for his mother, for his family, and then didn't pay Howard Hughes back, paid him back $200,000 on some collateral of $40,000. Now, if you want to interpret those things as bribes, you could get a lot of people. The significant thing is that the three Seattle prosecutors, the three prosecutors in the state of Washington, who were not Democrats, incidentally, looked at the same charge and turned it down. The Attorney General of the state of Washington, in filing a civil suit against his Attorney General and me, did not mention any charge of bribery. It remained for the federal government to find it 4 years after I personally had reported to Internal Revenue Service that I had made these payments to him. So that's the charge. Now, the judge has already indicated that he's going to eliminate 1.5 years of their from their allegations, and before we're through, I think we'll get the whole thing thrown out. Is there anything else you'd like to ask on that?
Why is it that you would have relations be involved with matters in Washington?
State of Washington. In my antitrust practice, I started out in the antitrust laws back in 1948. My first case was a case filed in New Jersey against the National Lead Company. The second case was a case in Detroit, which I filed on behalf of Walt Disney, Sam Goldwyn, Walter Wanger, and a few others in Detroit. I have had cases in Hawaii, in Salt Lake City, long before I undertook this business in 1960. I had tried cases, antitrust cases, all over the country. Prior to the electrical cases, there were probably only 3 of us who represented the claimants, or the consumer side, against the monopolies. Only 3 firms in the entire country. Most of those who came out of the antitrust division went with the big corporations, did defense work instead of work for the consumers and for the independent businessmen. That's the basis on which I was selected.
In this relationship, weren't you in a state office in California at this time, or was I wrong?
Oh no,
You weren't.
I was a private lawyer.
Okay.
This is the first elective office I've ever held, this mayor's job, which I've had since '68. Yes,
I've
sir.
got two questions, one specifically relating to your responsibilities as a mayor, and another one just about your opinion on a more national level. I recently read an article about San Francisco in Life magazine, just a couple of months ago, concerning some urban renewal programs and how some old people were being displaced and they really
Yes.
didn't have anywhere to go. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and try to, tell what's being done in that respect.
Okay.
And the other question I have is that concerning our involvement in Southeast Asia, do you favor an immediate withdrawal with a definite deadline within the next year?
Okay. With respect to the first thing, there is an area south of Market which before this time had been called Skid Row. Every major city has a Skid Row. These are very unfortunate people who couldn't take the competition anymore, and these were the original dropouts by reason of alcohol rather than drugs. We, some time ago, made a plan to build a huge complex which included a sports arena, a convention center, a hotel, just off Market Street, off downtown. It's a 6-block area. A portion of it was a Skid Row area. The allegation was made by a group of people that we didn't have sufficient relocation resources for those in Skid Row. We claimed we did have. And as of this moment, there is not one case of anybody in San Francisco under a redevelopment process or otherwise who's been out on the sidewalk with his furniture, with no place to go. He's always had a place. At one juncture, a court determined that he was not going to count a downtown hotel or anything that didn't have a kitchen set up as a place to live. Now, it's an unfortunate thing, but it is a fact of life that some of these unfortunate persons who live in Skid Row don't want to live in anything but hotels with community feeding facilities and otherwise. They're incapable actually of cooking their own meals. But the court refused to recognize a downtown hotel as a, quote, relocation resource, and for a while held up the project. Then the federal government made a survey and certified to the court that the relocation resources were actually there. Now, actually, we've built more socially oriented housing in San Francisco than any city in California, including Los Angeles. Almost all of the socially oriented housing has been built by San Francisco, Richmond, Oakland, Los Angeles, some in San Jose, and some in Sacramento. We have done our share of it. We are continuing to do more of it. We have 3,000 units ready to go right now, except that the President is withholding an appropriation made by the Congress in the amount of $1.2 billion for socially oriented housing after the Congress made that appropriation. So our record on that is quite good. It's quite good. And those are the facts with respect to relocation. Very early when I was mayor, I set up in my office something called a Relocation Appeals Board, which was a board that anybody who felt aggrieved by relocation, for whatever reason, condemnation based on schools, based on redevelopment, based on anything else, anybody who felt aggrieved, who didn't think he was being given a comparable opportunity for decent, safe, and sanitary housing, could appeal to this board. In the 2.5-year period of time, we've had 2 minor cases. In addition to that, San Francisco, at my request, the Board of Supervisors, and it's the only city in the country that's done this, appropriated $500,000 to assist in relocation, including rent supplements if necessary, to assist in relocation. And this is city money is distinguished from federal money, which is generally used in this area. So that's our record with respect to that. Now, the young lady raised a question a moment ago, isn't housing more important than some of these other things? Some of us don't think so. Some of us think that job opportunities are the most serious problem we are facing today. But in any event, that's the story on that relocation business. I think when you scan the record, and nobody will ever find anybody out in the street with his furniture and no place to go. It just is not going to happen in my town. on Southeast Asia. I think I've already said in connection with the demonstration in Vietnam that we held in San Francisco with 200,000 marches, that I issued a statement in connection with the demonstration that I thought they were right, that I thought we had to get out of Vietnam and get out now, that regardless of the original merits of the CEDAW collective security agreement, and everybody agreed at that time it was a good thing, just as everybody agrees looking backwards at NATO that was a good thing. That is the Marshall Plan and the military help to Western Europe at that time. But it's very clear, and some of us were saying this back in '68, not a question of now. In '68, that there had to be an orderly withdrawal that should have started much earlier. And now it's very clear that we have a war that we cannot explain to ourselves any longer, can't explain to anybody who's being asked to make the sacrifices for it, and we ought to get out, certainly by the end of the year. That's my feeling on it, as I expressed at the time of the demonstration.
Sir, didn't you make a comment just a few months ago that some of the senators who favor immediate withdrawal from Southeast Asia didn't know what they were talking about?
Well, back in 1968, at the time the issue was being debated, I took the position in a referendum that was on the ballot in San Francisco, which called for an immediate withdrawal. That if that meant a Dunkirk-type withdrawal as of that date, that I didn't think it was a very smart thing. That we ought to simply phase ourselves out of Vietnam. That was a statement made in 1968. But I think that a sufficient time has elapsed now where we ought to get out by a definite date, and the end of the year is as good a definite date as any.
Yes.
I'd like your opinion on Mayor Stokes' proposal about the housing in the federal government.
First of all, one my opinion on Carl Stokes himself. He's a great mayor, doing an outstanding job in a city with tremendous difficulties. You know, if we think we have problems out in the West Coast, we have to think of a city like Cleveland, where they've had a recreation budget last year, I think, of $8 million, and this year of $900,000, which means they've closed down their parks, their playgrounds, their swimming pools, closed down their police academy, among other things. Have an incredible polarization that's resulted in a recent election in which they had up for the question of whether to increase the tax to cover some of these city services you're talking about. You have a 99% vote in the black community and a 99% vote the opposite way in the white community, almost complete polarization. They've had to reduce their school services, their police services, their fire services, their street sweeping services. They're real crisis in about 5 cities in this country. It's Newark, Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit. New York is getting that way, and so is Philadelphia. The proposal, if there is a conspicuous failure of competitive capitalism, and it's still the best system ever invented by anybody for getting most things to most people, those failures are its inability to supply housing for the poor, and also its inability to supply full employment. These are the 2 conspicuous failures of competitive capitalism. So it means, therefore, that if it fails, the government has to take over and supply these 2 areas, both on housing and on employment. Now, how it does it is really a matter of indifference and mechanics. Carl has a specific plan that he announced, I believe, in Indianapolis the day before yesterday, and I don't know the details of that plan. But in one form or another, we simply have to do it. Now, it's kind of a sad fact that some of the European countries, France and Ireland, the Scandinavian countries, have done a little better job on housing for the poor than we have in this country. We've made substantial strides, but not nearly enough to fill the demand for low-cost housing or socially oriented housing. And I say in this state, we in San Francisco have done as much as anybody, as much as any group, and we have a lot more ready to go if we can get some of the funds released for that purpose. But there isn't any doubt. I think even Senator Taft acknowledged in the mid-50s that private industry simply could not supply a sufficient number of homes. The government has got to do it, and the form in which it does it is almost a matter of indifference. It just ought to do it.
And let's take 2 more questions.
You were speaking earlier about the chilling effect of the infiltration of student groups.
Yes.
Well, this is going on in this university and all over the country, obviously, as we all know. How do you feel that this can be stopped immediately? Or what kind of controls can
Well,
be
the only way you can
put on
stop it is by electing people who don't believe in that thing, who aren't frightened. I don't know any other way of stopping it. There's just too much surveillance. I guess I don't know whether you folks read my testimony before the Urban Committee in Washington, not only on the compiling this much stuff, but giving it out in 14 or 15 sessions, giving it out to a couple of young people that nobody ever heard about before. Just giving it out, including your Los Angeles Police Department here, their intelligence department, permit a writer who's going to write things for a scandal-oriented magazine for profit, permitting him to sit down for 2 full days and look over their entire file list, select anything he wanted, and they go get it for him. For 2 full days, and he's sitting within 3 feet of the captain, the head man of that particular unit. I don't know why people do things like this, but they do things like this. And the only guarantee you have against it is by electing the kind of people who philosophically are geared not to be frightened, so frightened, of the students particularly, that they have to infiltrate things and tap everybody's telephone wire. We just assume today that our wires are tapped by public or private groups. As a matter of fact, I always say hello twice when I answer a telephone to be sure I'm covering the fellow who's talking to me and then the fellow who's tapping the phone.
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to know what you think of Alvin Duskin, first of all. And then, reading him, I understand that the buildings in San Francisco, the jobs they offer jobs to people living outside the city. So they wouldn't help employment inside the city that much. And second of all, the smog would take a great increase from commuting of people outside the city to their job
Also,
in the
the
big
tax
building.
for the residents of San Francisco would go up because of the sewers and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Well, as you know, the Alvin Duskin proposal, which is now on the ballot, has been repudiated by him. Under that Alvin Duskin proposal, even our 40-foot height limits that I told you about would go out, and they would be almost unlimited height limits even there. It is true that the central cities have a lot of people who work outside those central cities. And that not only goes for private employment, it goes for our civil service as well. Approximately 22% of those who work for the city live outside the city. I have some feeling about that so far as policemen and firemen are concerned, because theoretically they're on duty 24 hours a day. And they ought to be on duty, where a fire might occur or where their service would be needed. But as to others, the blunt fact of the matter remains that San Francisco is a city which has a high occupancy on housing. And to force everybody who worked in the city, which you couldn't do in private industry, of course, you couldn't do that constitutionally. You could do it for public employment. But to force everybody who works for the city to live in the city would create such a pressure on rentals to force them upward for everybody in San Francisco that would be even a more serious thing than the fact that somebody lived out of town at the present time. I am satisfied with the rate of growth on minority employment. I'm satisfied that we've done a considerable amount in San Francisco, particularly in opening up the civil service through what we call, it's not an evasion of the civil service rules, but it's a kind of a substitute for civil service on what we call long-term tenure. We have opened up the civil service to blacks, to Chicanos, to Asians, to a very great extent in San Francisco. So that rule is not keeping the minorities from being employed in San Francisco, and it's hard to make a rule, but this whole business of you have to keep a very delicate balance on all of the things you build, all of the jobs you want, all of the artistic effects you want to get, and you make a balance between a planning commission. First of all, you select a first-rate planning commission, and you select a planner, and then you tell them. You want to disagree with me or anybody else publicly, you go ahead and do it. You're an independent agency, and mean it. And it's been demonstrated in San Francisco. He disagreed with everybody on the Transamerica building, for example. I think, 20 years from now we'll find out I think 20 years from now, I don't know why all buildings have to have one form, either square or otherwise. If you look at the great cities of Europe, there's a great variety in the skyline. You know, you have domes and temples and towers and all of these things. But the point is, if your planner is permitted to be absolutely independent, express his views independently, you have some guarantee that you're not going to have a sacrifice the beauty of a town for building. And I don't think we are in San Francisco. I really don't.
Thank you very much, Mayor Alioto. Thank you all.
Pleasure being here.
Glad being here.